Hey Jason, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. Great to see you. Great to have you here at SerpGuru Coffee Chats. I'm here with Arturo, my co-founder.
Hi, Jason.
Hello.
So I'll just set the stage. Jason Mikula is a great expert in content and consulting. He started his journey on that arena, but in the past, he's worked for multiple companies in consumer finance, lending in the US and the UK, including some B2B companies. I'll let him explain his journey and his expertise, but I'm very, very pleased to have him joining in SerpGuru Coffee Chats.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that introduction. As Alfredo said, I've been in sort of the digital marketing and consumer finance, consumer lending spaces for just over 10 years now, which is hard to believe when I say that out loud. And really got my start in Chicago in digital marketing, and over the course of the past 10 years have sort of expanded my skill set to what I would call like ancillary or related areas that help facilitate customer acquisition. So that could be aspects of product management, as far as how do you work with developers, QA to actually build and deploy features. It could be more product design, product marketing questions around what do consumers want, how do you position it versus competitors in the marketplace, what actual language do you use to talk about it. And currently I work as both consultant and content producer. So I run my own newsletter, which is focused on fintech and banking. And then I also work with clients on an advisory or consulting basis for these kinds of topics or projects.
Excellent, thanks a lot. And that's a great segue to learn a little bit more from your side as far as how you find information on your potential customers.
Yeah, so I kind of split that into two buckets, right? One is, me as a sort of standalone business, how do I find information or go about sort of building a pipeline of potential customers or clients that I might consult with? And then the second is, in the practice of doing that consulting or project, how do my customers find customers? Mm-hmm. So let me start with the first one, and if we want to talk about the second, we can as well. So, for myself, the first question is defining who is a potential customer or client of mine. And primarily, I've been working with companies in the financial services space, right, which makes sense given my background. And when I think about how do I find them, and my initial point of contact is typically, founder, CEO, or potentially investors, so VCs who are investing in startups. And I found that a really good way to both sort of gather information as well as develop those that sales pipeline, is go where your customer is, and that's true whether you're doing B2C marketing, which is my background, or B2B marketing, which is what I'm doing when I'm sort of selling myself or selling my consulting services. In some of the places I've found that have worked well, right, are, and it's not secret, it's not any big secret, but LinkedIn, right, where do founders, CEOs, executives spend time and gather their information? Mm-hmm. Twitter, which is, I sort of think of it as a less formal and faster velocity subset of LinkedIn, right? And also Slack. Right. A lot of people are not aware there's sort of private Slack communities, or call it semi-private, semi-public, that foster discussion, networking, and particularly in this sort of COVID era where in-person meetings are limited, travel is limited. I found that all three of these have been a really great channels to both network, identify what the needs are in the marketplace, and sort of build my call it sales pipeline or consulting pipeline.
No, that's a very good point. And I would say the pandemic has helped reach out people that you wouldn't be able to reach otherwise, because even though you're not traveling and going in person to meetings or conferences and whatnot, many people, many professionals have been available over these social media platforms, not both public, but also private communities such as Slack. So thanks for that. How do you manage in this plethora of information to filter what adds value from the, the noise or the clutter, if you will?
That is a really good question and a really big challenge. If I think of the types of information I'm consuming, right now I'm really thinking about the newsletter I produce. How do I think about sourcing information and then sort of evaluating or putting that information into context, right? So I mean, there is far too much information being generated to consume and sort of process on a daily basis. So the way I sort of think about approaching that are, what are my sort of like secondary or intermediary sources? So basically, trusted, legitimate business publications that are writing about the industry that I'm focused on. So fintech, to some extent, regtech, or the regulatory technology startup environment, and then sort of the spheres that impact that. So that could be, politics. And today, as we're recording this, the Senate runoff races in Georgia are happening. That potentially has a really real impact on what kind of legislation is introduced, what can pass, who Biden can appoint rather, and that impacts the businesses that I work with or advise. So I mean, I approach it as sort of secondary, using trusted publications that sort of act as a filter to highlight the most important developments. And then I like to actually, time permitting, go to sort of the source of truth or whatever document or event they may be reporting on. So an example of that is yesterday, the 5th of January, there was a task force report put out by the CFPB. The thing is like 900 pages. Nobody has time to read that, including me. But if you're relying on, Bloomberg or American Banker or somebody to sort of intermediate this, you're getting sort of their perspective or their whatever points they think are sort of most salient, which depending on the business you're in, may or may not be the points that you care about. So time permitting, I like to sort of go to the original source document to really sort of dig into, well, this is what people are talking about, but what's really happening here? And then how does that impact the kinds of businesses, the kinds of companies that I work with or aspire to work with?
Jason, and in terms of the way that you add value through your newsletter, is that just kind of the curation process of selecting what type of information you're sharing with the people that have subscribed to your newsletter? Or do you actually put, create like a new piece of content and give it like maybe some, put in a little bit of your, personality or brand that you want to develop? What's the process that you follow?
Great question. And really, it's more of the latter. So when I decided to sort of launch this project, which was late last year, I sort of looked at, what do I read? What do I consume? What already exists in the marketplace? And it was a lot of sort of the first part of what you mentioned, which is curation. So I mean, you get, and with Substack, it's really easy to put out a newsletter, very quickly and easily. You've seen an explosion in content, particularly email newsletter-based content. And so much of what I saw was basically curation. So it's like, okay, here's what happened last week. Here are 10 links or 20 links to funding announcements or product announcements or, IPOs or whatever. And that information is important, but, as I sort of got at in one of my earlier statements, it's often not the full story, right? Like that might be, call it the PR story or the headline story, but there's often something else that's happening or some other goal or intention with that news release, which if you don't sort of pause and ask the question, who's putting out this story, why, what's their business, what's their goal, how does this align with other things that are happening that are maybe not part of what's being reported on in this specific release. So what I attempt to do is, it's often keyed on a current event, something that's happening. So maybe it's, something related to like buy now, pay later, for example, which is a super, super hot, super trendy topic, particularly with a firm and their pending IPO, and sort of pause and say, okay, everyone is talking about, this is the hottest sector. Look at the crazy multiples. A firm's worth $10 billion. And try to ask the question like, well, what's really happening here? Or what is the story that people are missing because they're sort of so focused on these headlines? So I really try to focus more on the latter, which is adding value by adding, original insight and analysis that, that I'm in a position to sort of provide as a function of having spent 10 years in this space of consumer lending, online lending, and fintech.
Excellent. And given that tenure, can you share with us a successful customer acquisition hack?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that you use the word hack. I've had a number of conversations with sort of like marketing industry folks about the term growth hacking recently. And for those who may be less familiar, that term really comes out of sort of early Facebook days, and it's an intersection of how do you use attributes of sort of product and product design to drive customer acquisition. Yeah. And one of the sort of old school examples I always give is like Farmville, right? And I'm dating myself a little bit here, but Farmville was able to very rapidly and very cheaply, if not almost for $0 cost of customer acquisition, get customers because they built it into the mechanics of the game, where if you sent your friends a request and they joined, you'd get a certain amount of points. I think a sort of more modern version of that is what Robinhood did pre-launch. In some respects, I'm not the biggest fan of Robinhood's business model, but that's a different question for a different day. But I am a fan of what their pre-launch strategy was, which was they generated value for sort of the first party user, somebody who's coming to sign up for a wait list. But then they gamified this by saying, we're going to allow you to sort of move up this list and get access earlier the more friends you refer to the wait list. And then the last piece is making that knowable by having a leaderboard showing how many points do you have. And the reason why this was so successful, well, there's a couple of reasons, but one, the product that people were signing up to wait for was novel. Everyone else is charging a $5 commission or a $10 commission. Robinhood is saying, we're going to give this away for free. For the users who are coming to sign up to wait for it, there's an exchange of value happening there, right? I'm giving Robinhood my email address or phone number, but I get earlier access to this product, which is exciting and unique and free in theory anyway. And then the next step is, how do you make that go viral? And that is sort of the gamified component of, I can move up this list and know where I stand on the list based on referring my friends to it. And then sort of the question is, well, why, what is going to make me comfortable sort of soliciting my friends? Now, the Farmville example kind of demonstrates that people are willing to spam their friends for very little incentive. But in the Robinhood case, the sort of flywheel effect of why it was so effective is, they're giving something to their friends that is also of value to them. So I think it's a really good, call it marketing case study of a growth hack or a viral marketing program that generated value for everybody that was sort of participating. The company, the sort of first user, and then the flywheel effect of the users that they're recruiting downstream.
Jason, let me change a little bit, talking about the growth hack concept. Because as you mentioned, you gave two examples, the Farmville example, which I think, for a lot of people was a very, intrusive marketing tactic. And you gave the example of Robinhood, which is more of like a little bit traditional, approach. And then there is, a lot of like case studies around, for example, Airbnb using it in its initial days, Craigslist to leverage, the promotion of their properties, and Twitter doing a promotional activity in a very important conference, right? So it's usually like the concept of growth hack attached to a very successful tactic. So it's really on a more tactical level. And so from that standpoint, I wanted to get like your point of view around, a lot of people are thinking about like this hack or this, this like very specific thing. But in your experience, like what's the balance when you're trying to develop a growth strategy for your clients around, what you can obtain through growth hack and what you actually obtain by, just having like a clear roadmap strategy, that you need to execute consistently in the next 3 years, and not like these very specific actions that you are trying to target?
I mean, that's a great question. And I think, there's a couple of different pieces to it. I think to have a successful, whether you want to call it growth hacking or maybe like a friendlier version of like product-led growth, which means something arguably slightly different, but it's about designing a product and designing features that generate value. Now, can you take that arguably too far in a way where how that value is distributed becomes unequal? Yes, and I think an interesting example of that, is Venmo, right? Venmo as a business has network effects, right? So as more people join it, it generates more utility for everybody. And as a marketer, that's like the dream, right? And Uber actually arguably has similar network effects. Facebook itself, back in the day, Instagram, these are all businesses where as your friends join them, they become more valuable for everybody who's using the service. So that is sort of a, call it natural growth hack or product-led marketing, product-led growth technique. Now, where it could go too far, depending on your point of view, is Venmo's defaulting people to have their transactions be public. This was a, quote unquote, social aspect of the product. And I actually live in the Netherlands, so I don't use Venmo very frequently anymore. But you would see, people write funny comments, tag their friends, put emojis, and it was, an quirky component of sort of what the product was. Now, the counterpoint is that was publicly available data that was exposed on APIs, meaning that anybody could go and see some elements of what these transactions were. And arguably, most people who are using Venmo then or now, did not realize that they were making that information publicly available. So, I mean, depending on sort of your ethical standpoint on growth hacking or marketing as a discipline, it can be challenging to understand what is the trade-off between, a low cost of customer acquisition, trying to achieve those viral or network growth effects, and at what point does it diminish utility or infringe on privacy, right? And so it's like, do you want to be Farmville? Do you want to be Venmo? Or does that generate an environment where you're actually, making the customer experience worse in some regard?
Well, great conversation and dialogue about, point of views about growth, hacking, product-led, and other strategies. Shifting gears now to the soft skills or the mindset, if you will. Given your background as a performance marketer, Jason, what type of businesses attract you the most? If it's services.
Yeah, so I like to joke that I kind of got into consumer finance. I won't say by mistake, but I've been living in the Caribbean, and I moved back to the U.S. and was recruited by a financial services company, and that was sort of the first first entry point I had into that as a discipline. And my background at that point was firmly growth marketing, specifically like paid search, organic search. And as far as what businesses I find, if not the most interesting, at least call it the easiest to apply those skills in or those tactics in, they lend themselves really well to high volume businesses, which tend to be consumer businesses, and also companies that have products with a short sales cycle. So the example I'll give is the difference between, even in financial services, the difference between a personal loan, which might have a 1 to 7 day consideration cycle from somebody starting to do research to making that decision and making a purchase, compared to a mortgage, which might take 30, 60, 90 days from the time that somebody begins shopping, comparing quotes, to when that mortgage actually closes. And the reason why these two variables, the amount of transactions and the speed at which a transaction happens, is critical for performance marketing, is it generates more data more quickly. So if you're running a channel like Google Ads or Facebook or affiliates or whatever, the time from when you incur a cost, which could be an impression or a click, to the time that sales happens, the shorter that is, the easier it's going to be to understand the relationship between those two activities. Mm-hmm. Also, the more data points there are, the easier it is going to be to understand the relationship between those two activities.
Great. And as far as resilience and motivation, how do you maintain yourself motivated?
Great question.
I know you are based in we haven't talked about this, but you're based in the Netherlands. You're American, but you are across the pond. So maybe you can share about that too.
Yeah. I mean, that's relevant as well, right? So, I moved here to the Netherlands for personal reasons. And one of the challenges, and this goes into motivation as well, is, most of my professional network and a lot of the work I do is with folks in the US, which is, 6 or maybe 9 hours behind if I'm working with somebody who's in San Francisco or California. And, I find that maintaining motivation for me, a key component of that is being part of an ecosystem, right? So, I mean, it's easy, particularly during this sort of like COVID situation, and I'm working from home 100%.
Right.
It's really easy to spend the entire day and not see another person. And so I find that by carving out time to have, conversations with people, preferably like this, face to face, even if it is on Zoom, is a really great way to keep myself grounded and motivated, and exposed to sort of new and different ideas, right? You asked earlier about sort of where I source my information from, and it's really easy, whether in marketing or fintech or other areas of life, to enter sort of a filter bubble where you're reading points of view that confirm what you already think, mm-hmm. Which can be a bit dangerous. And I find that having conversations, preferably longer than 140 characters on Twitter, mm-hmm. Having a real conversation with somebody can help me, question my own assumptions or own data set or own decision making, sort of process or framework, in a way that, sitting at home working all day staring at my laptop, does not. So to go back to your original question, as far as motivation, I find being able to interact with other, thoughtful, experienced, skilled leaders, whether it's in my own industry or in different industries, is a key way that I keep myself motivated.
That's awesome, great. And well, we appreciate your time. I know it's later there in Europe. In terms of setbacks, what has been your biggest setbacks as an entrepreneur, and how did you overcome that?
Great question. I think everyone in life has experienced setbacks. In my course of work as an entrepreneur, as a consultant, I've had relationships with clients that didn't work out, and that's never a good feeling, right? As whether you're an employee or a consultant, you want to make sure that you're generating value for your partner, whether that partner is an employer or business partner or firm that you're advising, and it's never a good feeling when that doesn't happen. But I think the lesson I've learned from that experience or experiences like that is you don't have control over everything. Now, if there's a change in the composition of a board of directors, or if there's turnover in a management team, as much as Silicon Valley or tech likes to describe itself as a meritocracy, so much of business is personality driven and is about finding who do I work well with, who do I not work well with, communication, as cliche as that may sound, and there are events that are outside of your control. I mean, right now, I think that's true for literally everybody. There are a lot of events that are outside of our control, and when that changes or impacts a business relationship or a working relationship, you can't let it get to you, or spend a day, lick your wounds, and then be like, okay, you have to move on and go to the next thing. And not that you can't learn from those experiences, you can and you should, but sometimes circumstances change or counterparties change, and the relationship isn't what it is when you started, and learn your lessons and move on to the next thing.
And I can relate to that too. That's happened to me in the past as well. It doesn't matter who's at fault, but it could be a blow to the ego sometimes. But to your point, it's about moving on and carry on. I like to ask this question to my interviewees: is what's your favorite book, one that you've come across recently, and why?
Yeah, so this biased by my geographic location, but I have been very slowly making my way through historical book about Amsterdam, which is called something like Amsterdam, A History of the World's Most Liberal City, liberal in the lowercase L sense. And it's interesting in that so much of, I think Amsterdam has had an outsized impact both on political systems as well as economic systems. So, there have been some really interesting sort of structural developments, right? So some of the earliest joint stock companies, like the Dutch East India Company, Dutch West India Company, these formed the ideas of owning stock in a venture. And then the world's first stock market, stock exchange, also was founded in Amsterdam as a way to trade these shares. And these are ideas that are still, not still with us, more prevalent than ever. When you start thinking about things, whether it's Bitcoin, or crypto assets, cryptocurrencies, or something else I was reading about recently, ISAs, income share agreements, which is a way of basically selling a right to your future wages. All of these ideas stem from the idea that you can create an extraction layer on top of some sort of asset, whether you call it a share or a token, something like that, and then trade this through some sort of exchange, and that creates a marketplace that allows you to value it as that value changes over time. So yeah, I am slowly making my way through that book, but certainly some interesting facts that I did not know about the Netherlands.
Very nice. We'll look into that. I have one more last question for me, and then I'll pass to Arturo. Is there any fun fact that people don't know about you?
Yeah, I stole my own thunder on this one, but after I finished graduate school, I, like I said, lived in the Caribbean, specifically on the island of St. Lucia for about 2 years, serving as a Peace Corps volunteer. And if you have listeners who are sort of like not familiar with that organization, it was founded by John F. Kennedy in the 1960s, actually somewhat as a tool of American propaganda, basically a instrument to extend American soft power to combat the Soviet influence during the Cold War. That is not what I was doing in St. Lucia. I was working on building sort of institutional capital, so working with local organizations in the village I lived in to basically help them develop the infrastructure tools necessary to do things like apply for grants, right? So something that we might take for granted in a developed country like the US or the Netherlands, the group I worked with, it was like 10, 15 people. It was informal. They wanted to make a difference in the village they lived in, but you can't just go apply for a grant. You're not a nonprofit. You're not any sort of legal entity. You're just a group of 10 or 15 citizens. So working with them to understand what is the framework you need to be sort of incorporated as a nonprofit, bylaws, bank account, particularly in that region, sort of controls over, okay, if you raise money, how do you audit that, make sure it's going where it needs to. So yeah, a really interesting way to spend a couple of years, before going back to corporate life.
Arturo, do you have any questions for Jason? So thanks again, Jason, for your time. Great conversation. We enjoy meeting you again and hear from your journey and experiences. Wish you the best on your newsletter and consulting projects, and hopefully we'll have you soon. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure to see you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, Jason.